unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. With general elections just months away, it is the era of the 10-year retrospective, a chance for India watchers to reflect on what has changed over the past decade under the Modi government and what has not. One area especially deserving of scrutiny is India's relations with the neighborhood. The Modi government came to power with an eye towards reimagining India's relationships in South Asia and across the Indo-Pacific. Yet the past 10 years have seen tremendous upheaval in the region, set against a backdrop of growing competition between India and China to gain the upper hand. Few people in India have watched this space more closely than my guest on the show today, Tino Xavier. Tino is a fellow in foreign policy and security studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. He is also a non-resident fellow in the foreign policy program at Brookings. I am pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Tino, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Milan. It's wonderful to be here on this great Grand Tamasha.
I want to start by asking you a bit of an unfair question. It's a big question, but maybe we can sort of drill down after we cover this kind of macro territory. As I said just a few moments ago, we are coming up on the end of 10 years of the Modi government. This government pretty early on made a shift in its foreign policy posture, right? It signaled right from the beginning that it planned to step up its regional engagement in a fundamentally new and different way. When it came to the sort of eastern neighbors, right, it talked about how it wanted to move beyond looking east to acting east. I want to ask you about the kind of immediate neighborhood. You know, after a decade, 10 years in power, how much change do we see in foreign policy practice when it comes to India's neighbors?
A lot of ground to cover, Milan. This is a huge neighborhood. We're talking about 2 to 3 billion people living in and around India. But let me give it a shot. I think you put it right that Prime Minister Modi in 2014 signaled he would step up. For sure. That signaling was quite clear towards its smaller neighbors. We're talking about Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. People forget sometimes that India has maritime neighbors in Thailand and Indonesia too, but most of the small immediate neighboring countries, which include also the Maldives and Sri Lanka. But making a shift, I'm not so sure. Maybe I've studied too much history and I'm becoming a cynic and I see these movies playing over and over again on India, the neighborhood. Because I've seen successive prime ministers in India, successive governments coming in and promising that the neighborhood would become the foremost priority in their foreign policy. It's maybe a bit like Mexico or Europe in US foreign policy. It makes an appearance early on, but then sort of disappears. And we've seen prime ministers like Morarji Desai, also from other parties. It's not only a Congress or BJP story. We've seen Rajiv Gandhi in the 80s. We've seen Gujral in the 1990s. We saw the BJP coalition government of Vajpayee in the early 2000s. And of course, the coalition by the Congress under Manmohan Singh after 2004, all of them coming in and saying, this is it. We're going to correct the immense credibility gap that we have in the neighborhood, and we will focus on this periphery that we have so often overridden for larger interests, whether it was the US or Soviet Union or China or other important actors. But this time, I have to say it's been a little bit different. And I think it hasn't fizzled out as much, the neighborhood. In particular, because of, I think, a sustained, continued focus on the neighborhood. And let me try to explain maybe 3 reasons why we've seen that, why there's sort of a continued focus on the neighborhood since 2014. One is politics. We've seen Prime Minister Modi use foreign policy for electoral gains at home. And nowhere else, of course, is the Indian electorate more responsive than when you talk about the great power India, the predominant power India in its own neighborhood. That's a good story. It's a story that sells. It's a relatively easy story because sometimes you have to take a quick flight of an hour or two to be in a neighboring country, and you score a foreign policy victory and at the same time an important domestic victory. And as you know, Milan, many of these neighboring countries have deep ethnic, political, social ties with states on the Indian side. So if you want to win an election in Bihar, it matters what you do in Nepal. If you want to have a chance, let's see what happens in a few months, but if you have a chance in Tamil Nadu, in the south, you want to have a particular focus on your policy with Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and West Bengal. So there's a variety of cross-border political links that have driven that sustained political element in Modi's foreign policy on the neighborhood. And it matters also, politics in the neighborhood. These are countries that have weak bureaucracies, weak foreign ministries, where a lot of the relations are very much leader to leader. You could say that applies to say, Modi and Trump and Biden, but these are more sustained, longer, deeper relationships. And a relationship between India and Nepal requires a very strong political hand to be played. The second reason why things haven't fizzled out is the logic of economic openness over the last 20 years, but in many ways is resulting only now in high growth rates across the region. Let's not forget that Nepal had a civil war until 2006. Sri Lanka had a civil war till 2009. Bangladesh had a succession of either dictators or military governments and a variety of difficulties in terms of stability till the 2000s. So what we see now is that markets are growing in this region. Bangladesh, for example, I think it's very surprising to see that Bangladesh now is the fifth largest export market of India. In fact, I think the India-Bangladesh trade volume pre-Ukraine war was larger than what India traded with Russia till 2021. And that has almost trebled now in 10 to 15 years at that trade volume. So these are countries that are growing fast in India's neighborhood. They're seeking investments and trade with India. And they're therefore demanding greater economic openness with India. So there's a strong economic growth story over the last few years that is also focusing India on delivering a bit more in the neighborhood. And finally, geostrategic competition in the form of China in particular. I think proximity can be deceptive. I think when we take our neighborhoods and our close partners often for granted, we think we know so much about them, and that's why we end up neglecting them. This has happened traditionally with India in its own periphery. It was broadly under India's economic and security umbrella until the 2000s. There was not much of an economic story because all these economies were closed, autarkic. And the rise of China in the neighborhood, post Belt and Road Initiative in 2014, has propelled India to watch much more carefully and compete with China in its own neighborhood. So China now being the largest trading partner of many of India's neighboring countries, China being the predominant investor in infrastructure, in Sri Lankan ports, in Bangladeshi roads and bridges, in Nepali airports, are making India to look up and try to rethink how it is operating in the neighborhood. And as always, competition is the best source of progress and innovation, and we see much more of that happening in recent years.
So that was terrific, Tino. Covered a lot of ground to a very unfair question. Let me try to ground this in a more specific geography. You recently co-edited a report on connectivity and cooperation in the Bay of Bengal region, and we'll link to that in the show notes. I want to ask you about some of the findings of the report. At the very front of this report, you write the following, and I want to quote you. You say, "The Bay of Bengal was once one of the most connected, integrated regions of the world. Today, however, the contrasting reality is rather different and grim," end quote. So let's start with a bit of context. To tell us a little bit about kind of what the Bay of Bengal of yesteryear was like, and contrast it with what it looks like today.
Yeah, Milan, I think the most interesting of that study with Amit and Dupalit, where we brought scholars from the region together to assess challenges and also opportunities of cooperation, was that what are regions really, right? They're malleable entities. If you'd asked in the 1950s or 60s people in Southeast Asia what is Southeast Asia, they would have, wouldn't have had much of an answer. This was a post-60s creation in the form of ASEAN, for example. There was, of course, an Indo-China element to it. But these regions emerge and decline, I think, in Asia. It seems natural to speak of Southeast Asia today. It is, I think, natural if we speak of South Asia. I think everyone understands that, though that's mostly an American creation. But the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation is the main organization since the 1980s for cooperation in the region. This was something that spanned sort of Afghanistan to Bangladesh, basically all of India's neighboring countries except China and Myanmar. But what we thought of is looking a little bit at this bridge region. It's called sometimes the sub-region, which is the Bay of Bengal, which is somehow between the Indian subcontinent, so India's eastern coast, and the Southeast Asian growth region of ASEAN, which is Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. And this region, there's a phenomenal body of work that tells us that this was a growth engine in Asia. This was one of the most integrated region up to the 1950s. Pre-colonial period, British colonial period, but even post-colonial period up to the 1960s. In many different ways. You had a large share of intra-regional trade. You had, for example, Burmese students studying in Kolkata at Kolkata University, for example, hundreds of students up to the 1960s. You had infrastructure and transportation that was better then in the 1950s than it is today. You had air connections between Bangladesh and northern Myanmar. You could fly between Sri Lanka and Thailand and Myanmar and smaller towns. You could fly between South Indian cities and northern Sri Lanka and Jaffna, for example, a flight that was just now restarted after 40 or 50 years. So it's an interesting region that used to be very integrated by all indicators. And then since the 1960s fell apart. And there are two reasons why. India adopted an economic autarkic model in terms of insulation. And with it, all of its neighboring countries also had to disrupt many of its flows, whether it's trade, people-to-people ties, linkages, etc. You had the hardening of borders. You had partitions between East Pakistan, for example, and West Pakistan. You had visa controls instituted post-1960. So it's the emergence of the modern states that paradoxically disrupt flows and connectivity. On the other side of the bay, you had Myanmar going into deep isolation under military regime in 1962, one of the most closed regimes in Asia. And when it opened up in the 1990s, economically at least speaking, it looked eastwards towards ASEAN, which was a growth engine and was a growth market that obviously was of interest to the military junta in Myanmar. And therefore, we have this gap actually between South and Southeast Asia and this region that once was a common whole, really fragmenting very quickly. And that is changing slowly now, but there's a long, long way to go. But again, I mean, to just situate some of our listeners, if you're sitting in Colombo in Sri Lanka, if you're in Chennai or in Kolkata on India's eastern coast, in Dhaka, Bangladesh, if even in Bhutan that was connected northwards with China and Tibet, but also southwards to the Bay of Bengal in terms of its export markets and supply chains in 1940s, 50s, etc., in terms of trade routes. If you're northeast of India in states like Assam, Tripura, or if you're in Sitwe or Mandalay in Yangon in Myanmar, or on the Andaman Sea, even on port city of Thailand like Ranong, if you're in Andaman Nicobar, this is really makes sense. It makes sense to speak of the Bay of Bengal as one common space. And let's see what happens. There are good indications that this region is coming together again, but it's going to take a long time to correct these 50 years of fragmentation.
So let me ask you about the future, because in the report, you have something very interesting to say on this, where you say, look, the Bay of Bengal is seeing rising levels of physical infrastructure connectivity, but this has not necessarily been commensurately matched by new cooperative habits, right? So there still seems to be a lack of kind of cooperative across regional mechanisms to try to manage and sustain connectivity in all its forms. So as you kind of look ahead, Tino, do you see any green shoots when it comes to kind of regional governance mechanisms that go beyond just, bilateral relations, say, between India and Bangladesh, between Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, between India and Thailand?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening now, this growing centrality and this attention we see on the Bay of Bengal, is in many ways because this is what is commonly called the heart of the Indo-Pacific. If you are serious about connecting the Indian Ocean region to the Pacific Ocean, if you are seeking stronger trade and security linkages between both these spaces, South and Southeast Asia have to come together. And that's exactly where the biggest gap is because of these 50 years of fragmentation. There's a wonderful prescient speech that then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave in Chennai, of all places, on the Bay of Bengal in 2011, where she speaks exactly about the Bay of Bengal as the future growth engine of Asia, as an area that has been stagnating, that has been neglected, and that has to be the focus of attention of India, of the US, of Japan, and of other Indo-Pacific powers. But what's happening as a paradox of this growing attention is that everyone is trying to fix this now. Everyone has a geopolitical, security, economic interest in trying to reconnect the Bay of Bengal and Southeast Asia. We're doing this in a global fractured system where China and the US are competing, and India is pivoting towards the US but has its own interests. The Japanese are also involved in many of these connectivity initiatives. So everyone is trying to race towards building connectivity and burdening many of these states that frankly had hardly any foreign policy towards economic integration in this region to be burdened with a variety of these pressures now. This means infrastructure financing. One of the reasons why Sri Lanka went through this massive financial crisis, and it was the first massive default in Asia since 1997, it's not the only one, but one of the reasons was the growing pressures on Sri Lanka, including Chinese loans, but also American expectation, Indian expectations, and this race towards, if you allow me to say, control Sri Lanka and make it switch sides or pivot into one or the other camp. That the Sri Lankan state in all its forms, whether political leaders or the bureaucracy, had tremendous difficulties in managing. To take on loans requires strong assessments of what loans you want to take, at what concessional rates, what is a grant, what is a loan, are the projects viable, whether it's a port, an airport, a metro line. And this is happening across this region now, whether it's Bangladesh, Myanmar, and other countries in this region. They're facing these pressures. So when we speak about the sort of risk of too much race to too much connectivity and pressures towards interdependence, there's of course states themselves are prepared to do this, more or less. Bangladesh has done a relatively good job at managing these pressures. And there's interesting literature in trying to explain state capacity in Bangladesh, whether it's the various ministries, the foreign ministry, the political leadership. Of course, political stability in the form of Sheikh Hasina since 2009 has helped that too. But if you're a country like Sri Lanka, which has seen a war, a succession of different leadership crises and instability, if you're a country like Nepal, which is not on the Bay of Bengal, but is a member of BIMSTEC, for example, the regional organization of the Bay of Bengal, that has seen 10 prime ministers in 10 years, you can imagine the difficulty of these states to deal with these pressures coming from global and external partners. This is, by the way, not only countries. This is also different development finance banks. The Asia Infrastructure Investment and Infrastructure Bank, for example, the New Development Bank of the BRICS. These are two banks, to speak of two new entities that have shown up in a big way in the Bay of Bengal region to finance. Of course, you have the World Bank and a variety of other institutions and the Asian Development Bank. But this sort of race now is actually a risk, if you allow me to put it like that, because unless you develop strong norms, standards, state capacity, and also cooperative habits within the region to manage and assess what type of connectivity you want, you'll end up to take a lot of suboptimal decisions.
So this is actually a really good segue, Tino, to what I wanted to ask you about next, which is this kind of hectic pace of activity in the neighborhood. And you certainly see this when you look at Indian foreign policy. You had a piece in 2023 where you talk about India's renewed engagement in bilateral terms, in trilateral formats, and also in these kind of, multilateral or plurilateral organizations like the Quad, among others. I want to ask you a little bit about kind of India's outlook, which is, how much of it is driven by the kind of looming China factor? I mean, in your mind, is that sort of the single most important variable in terms of shaping or reshaping how India is seeking to connect with many of its immediate neighbors?
I think China is, as I mentioned in my first answer, one of the three main factors that is driving India's neighborhood policy. And it's difficult to say what is what and what the share of China is, of course, driving this urgency in India to do more in the neighborhood. But I'd say, together with politics, that first factor I mentioned, it is an enabler, it's an accelerator of urgency. Different from the economic driver, which I see as a fundamental driver. I mentioned Bangladesh, for example, which is bound to graduate as a middle income country by 2026. This was, again, a country that was seen as an archetypical, least developed, fragile state up to the 2000s. And here we go. Bangladesh is in some ways wealthier than India today. It's certainly much wealthier than many parts of India today. So you have today Japanese companies setting up manufacturing industries along India's eastern coast, in Bangladesh, in the northeast region of India, to feed into supply chains with Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. So you have a whole growth story happening in this region that is premised on, in one way, yes, India's need to compete with China by partnering with other countries and opening up the region for business, literally, and opening up for business with other countries in the non-China camp. Today, you have India and Russia building a nuclear energy reactor in Bangladesh together. Today, you have India and Japan being, together with France, the co-chairs of the bailout process at the IMF for Sri Lanka, working together. India is very comfortable working uh, beyond the Paris Club within the IMF with these global north countries in Sri Lanka. Today, you have the Millennium Challenge Cooperation Project of the US investing $600 million in terms of a grant to build power connectivity between Nepal and India coordinating closely with the US to ensure power interdependence with Nepal, which has been sitting for decades on one of the largest hydropower potential in the world that remained unexplored, bizarrely, right? At some point, India was exporting electricity to Nepal 5, 6 years ago. Now, finally, for the first time, India is importing from Nepal. The potential is huge. So yes, China is always in the story, Milan. It's always there. Frankly, I like to say that China's done India a huge favor by showing up and shaking things up in the region because it's pushed the Indian government to rethink how it was doing things. Let me give you one example. A lot of the Indian infrastructure, trade, development projects in its neighborhood, where you would think India would deliver fast and efficiently, right? These are next door neighbors and smaller states. Were in the hands of public sector undertakings, the PSUs, the infamous PSUs, that have a record of non-performance at home. And you can imagine if at home they have difficulties. Try building a dam in Bhutan, try building a railway line in Bangladesh, try building a multimodal link in Myanmar that has been announced 20 years ago and is still being built. We see now a shift where the Indian government is realizing the importance of the private sector. That's a story of course, a stronger private sector within India. It's a story of a private sector that has done very well in the infrastructure sector at home, and therefore has built capacity now to perform beyond borders and interests. And therefore, you see a growing state and private capital partnership in critical sectors in the neighborhood. And that's in many ways been positive because it allows India to just deliver far faster on projects that For a change now, Milan, neighboring countries want India to deliver. If you're in the 80s and the 90s, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka were constantly pushing back against India and saying, we don't want connectivity with India. Why should we depend on India? We want to look at Southeast Asia. The Sri Lankans were always gravitating towards Southeast Asia from the 70s, 80s onwards. Today, if you go to Colombo, Dhaka, Kathmandu, or Male, officials, private sector in these countries is expecting much more from India and is seeing growth possibilities with India.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So I want to kind of dig into this a little bit deeper in one specific country context. You had edited another report with Jabin Jacob on China's approach to engaging South Asia. And one of the things that you two say in your introductory essay is that when you look at kind of important neighboring countries, I mean, I think you talk about Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, India is seen as too big to ignore or to even anger beyond kind of a certain threshold. But at the end of the day, each country has a unique equation with New Delhi. I want to ask you about a recent foreign policy crisis in a fourth country, which is the Maldives, where we have seen a recent change of government and a demand, which was, of course, has been there under the surface, for India to withdraw soldiers currently stationed on Maldivian soil. They look as if they are going to live up to that promise. Tell us a little bit about the sort of roots of this so-called India Out campaign, and how has India responded to this immediate crisis in its kind of proximate neighborhood?
So one point on China in the report we did broadly, then I come to the Maldives. On China, Milan, I got advice from a good friend of ours who's been on your program, Professor Srinath Raghavan, 10 years or 12 years ago, and he told me, work on the neighborhood, on India and the neighborhood. And I was like, what? Why would I do that? Who cares about the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal? I want to work on India, Germany relations, Japan, great power politics, etc., India, China. But this has become a very important region, very interesting to study. Number two, it is actually appalling how little Indian academia and think tanks and even the government knows about the affairs in these neighboring countries because they've been neglected, they've been taken for granted, and frankly, even on China. So when you have this behemoth China showing up in your neighborhood, there were two very distinct responses. In India, aligned with the divergence in India-China relations, which culminated in the Galvan crisis in 2020 in the military skirmish there. You see China portrayed as an existential threat almost for India, as a massive adversary, and that has led to the disruption of that relationship. So China is seen as a threat across the government, across civil society today, in most quarters. In all other countries, except India, China is seen as a benign, positive actor that is, for the first time, delivering on what other countries were not able to deliver or not willing. So you have this total dissonance in terms of how you look at China.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
So in Nepal, you go to Nepal, people are welcoming China in all its forms, whether it's investments, trade, people-to-people ties. Politicians love to have the Chinese ambassador around and let them, and I'm inviting the Chinese ambassador to interfere in local politics and say, you do it for a change. We've had enough of the Indians, so please help us mediate or unite different factions of a party. So China is now a resident power in the region, but with two very different perceptions from India and from other neighboring countries. Except for Bhutan and India, all other countries joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Only India and Bhutan stayed out of it. Now, in the Maldives, this is playing out with an added dimension, Milan. I think we talk a lot about, I talked even today also already a lot about how Prime Minister Modi has not been unique or new, but has done a rather, not unprecedented, but a rather a special job, if you want, at at using foreign policy for political support mobilization at home. So foreign policy has become political in India today, right? But we should not forget that the same is happening in India's neighboring countries. In fact, it's happening more than in India, which is difficult. But if you're today running for elections in the Maldives, which President Muizu, who was elected a few months ago, was, there is a huge temptation to make foreign policy rallying cry to mobilize support at home. And the particular foreign policy is one that is saying we will depend less on India, we will rely less on India, we will balance, we will do more with China, with the US or Japan or Turkey or the Saudis or the Pakistanis. But the India out slogan on which President Muizu ran as a candidate in the case of the Maldives had a huge, massive appeal within the country. The Maldives depended largely on trade with India. During its 2 or 3 different financial crises in the last 6 years, it relied massively on emergency lines of credit from India. And of course, there was a strong security dimension to the relationship where India sees the Maldives as a very important factor in its Indian Ocean maritime strategy. That means there's a variety of different Indian Ocean islands. In fact, your colleague Darshana Barua does great work on this at Carnegie, how India is setting up listening posts, not exactly maritime or naval bases, but there's a larger securitization of India's policy and presence in the Indian Ocean region. Now, if you're the small Maldives and you're trying to balance India, it's politically very tempting to run on anti-India slogans and campaigns. The problem is once you reach power, it is very difficult to dial back on that. And why? Because these countries were broadly run by either a dictator, in the case of the Maldives, President Gayoom, who was there for decades. In the case of Nepal, by a king. In the case of Bhutan, a king. In Sri Lanka, by a small elite. So if you're not so accountable to your electorate, you have a margin to change your foreign policy very quickly. Today, as democratic competition, electoral competition is heating up in all these countries in this neighborhood, this foreign policy element of whether you are pro-India, anti-India, pro-China, anti-China is front and center in any electoral campaign. So once you run on that, it's very difficult to dilute that and suddenly say, no, I'm going to make nice with India. And that's what happened in the Maldives. President Muizu ran on that. He was elected. And it is reasonable to expect that he has to deliver in some ways, sometimes symbolic ways. And in fact, I think that the outcome will be largely symbolic because while you will withdraw the military officials from India, probably there will be a civilian contingent who will keep doing that. But the biggest irony, Milan, is that the air ambulances and the airplanes that India had deployed in the Maldives were critical to ensure connectivity between the hundreds of different islands of the Maldives for emergency evacuations, hospital treatment, etc., for the Maldivian inhabitants. But you see to what extent politicians in the neighborhood today are willing to go down the route of let's try to balance India in order to mobilize support at home. And that is a big challenge for India. It will remain a big challenge for India's neighborhood policy.
So, this takes us to an area that you alluded to earlier, Tino, which is about state capacity. And it's a question of not just state capacity in the individual neighboring countries. It's also a question that India needs to reflect on. And back in 2023, you and Riya Sinha had a piece in which you noted that the Ministry of External Affairs, that is India's premier, externally facing agency, is one of the least funded central ministries in the government. And you analyze data going back 4 years that basically show a really flat line, right? Kind of budgetary stagnation. And the MEA's share of the overall budget is just around 0.4%. And you had this really striking sort of takeaway in this piece in which you say the MEA's budgetary limitations reflect the risk of a growing gap between India's declared foreign policy ambition to serve as a Vishwaguru and its limited financial and institutional capacity to achieve such a role in practice. As you look out at the budgetary numbers being what they are, what practical limitations does that relatively small MEA budget pose for how India can deal with the immediate neighbors?
Uh, since that report, I think the MEA has already announced it was going to increase um, its numbers in terms of staff, which will have a budgetary implication now, but it's still far too little. So I don't know if we're being read or not, but it's always nice to see that things are improving. And when you have a foreign service of around 1,000 officers, which is what Ministry of Foreign Affairs in some smaller European countries or Southeast Asian countries have. And you are dealing with the complexity of 1.3 billion people that is increasingly connected and interdependent with the neighborhood and the rest of the world. And then you add on that the prime minister that has been visiting most countries and signing on to the largest number of initiatives and hosting the G20 presidency last year. This obviously poses a huge challenge for India. Um, you have around 200 missions. India announced 2, 3 years ago the opening of another 20 missions in Africa. These have to be manned and staffed. India has Delhi here, the capital I'm speaking to you from, is the capital city, one of the largest number of diplomatic missions in the world. So staffing, so dealing with them and responding to them is also, of course, a huge challenge. So that is a huge challenge in terms of the people, but also the financial resources coming to the neighborhood. You have, for example, as I mentioned before, the growing demand from neighboring countries for India to support in terms of lines of credit and in terms of grants, projects in the neighboring countries for their developmental purposes. Now, if you're trying to build a bridge, a road, railways, dams, power transmission lines with your neighboring countries, you need a decent institutional apparatus and bureaucratic expertise to do this. India's foreign service is largely generalist foreign service. But within that, most governments today, the case of the US, for example, the case of Japan, the case of China, which has a new development agency, which started a few years ago, you have specialized bodies doing this. USAID, the DFC, for finance and development, for example, connected with the private sector. And to give you an idea, India first created a dedicated agency to do this in 2012, a little more than 10 years ago, which means that you are trying to do these things with a group of 20 people that are generalists and that are trying to deal with highly complex technical issues with very little preparation. So that's to give you one example that if you don't have, you actually may have the budgetary resources, but if you don't have the capacity to deliver on those, they're going to get delayed. They're not going to be implemented. We did another report on one of the roads that India was building in southern Nepal. I mean, for 20 years that road was being built. It's a 2-lane highway, so-called highway, and still not ready. Right? These are projects that, again, we're giving to public sector undertakings or fly-by contractors that were just not delivering. And that's exactly why the private sector is more important. Now, the good story, Milan, I think it's also fair to say that things are changing in the sense that the MEA was central and almost predominant in everything that happened beyond borders today. But today, you see a variety of other ministries having their own outreach beyond borders in the neighborhood. You saw India and Sri Lanka just signed an agreement on financial connectivity in terms of payment gateways. This is the MBA acting as a facilitator, but there are different ministries in India that are doing work on that. You see the defense services and the Ministry of Defense today much more present in the neighborhood. You see the Railways Ministry, the Inland Waterways Authority of India, for the first time in 50, 60 years, reviving waterways and rivers across the subcontinent as arteries for commerce with Bangladesh. You have the Ministry of Highways now interested in building highways beyond the region. So that's one reason where also there is change, and it's not only the MEA budget. The other one is, I think, also the growing role of the National Security Council. India has a relatively recent National Security Council from the early 2000s or late 1990s. But if you look at the staffing of the National Security Council Secretariat, the variety of people from across government that's serving in it, and the focus they've been putting on the neighborhood. It tells you also that there's new sides beyond the MEA where India is building capacity and has budgetary capacity to shape its neighborhood policy and accelerate it to deal with these many challenges.
Tino, I just want to kind of move to a slightly different geography and just get your quick thoughts on another emerging issue. If you go back to last year's G20 summit, leaders of 8 countries signed a memorandum of understanding announcing the initiation of a new India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC for short. In a recent piece, you sort of lament that very little has happened in the past 4 months on turning this corridor into reality. Obviously, the elephant in the room is the ongoing conflict in Gaza. But you write that, India has to take the initiative to try and flesh out the promise and potential of IMEC if it's going to make this not just something that shows up in a joint statement, but an actual opportunity. Give us a little bit of a flavor of the kinds of things you think India needs to do to lay the groundwork to try to fully leverage what is now kind of an idea in the abstract, but could be a full-blown reality in the future.
Yeah, this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor is a bit of a weird beast that showed up last minute at the G20 presidency. And Milan, how it goes. Sometimes there's to be what do you call deliverables and announcements. I believe the US had a very important role in this at the leaders level. France was part of it, Italy, the European Commission, UAE, Saudi Arabia, India, among others. So it showed up not exactly, but it didn't show up from nowhere. And let me explain to you two dynamics that gives us hints of what lies behind this and why it makes sense from an Indian perspective. Whether in 10 years or 20 years, who knows? And the point in my piece was that there will be conflicts and obstacles, but the geoeconomic logic of this IMEC will find its way into reality one way or the other. The first hint is that the IMEC is actually, to understand IMEC, we have to look to the east of India, not to the west of India, and look at what has no name, but is an economic corridor that is being established between India, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. This is the largest supply chain that is being developed between India and Japan. Japanese companies are seeking to diversify out of China. The Japanese government is supporting them. They're coming to India, but not as much as they wanted for problems in terms of regulations, openness. But they're also going a lot to Vietnam, to Thailand, and to parts of Southeast Asia. So the logic is to build a larger supply chain or an industrial corridor, the way the Japanese have called it now, between South Asia and Southeast Asia for Japanese companies to assemble at different stages of the production process across these different geographies. Now, the IMEC is the equivalent Western link to this that India is trying to establish to access the high growth markets in Europe and the North Atlantic. And that requires, of course, shipping routes, but we know the risks of shipping routes. We're seeing with the Houthi crisis. We saw it previously with the accident in the Suez Canal. But therefore, there is a logic to develop stronger synergies with the Gulf economies. And also through that, if you want some more or less idealistic, the idea that you can integrate these economies and sort of deal with the Middle East and pacify it. Now, Prime Minister Modi is, as we speak currently, in the UAE. I believe it's the 7th visit. This is now one of India's main trading partners. There's an FTA that India and the UAE signed. India, Israel the relations have flourished. There was also talk about a free trade agreement, and this remains an important trade and technology partner for India. Saudi Arabia, the relationship has developed very well. And of course, there's an interest in developing a stronger presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. I believe it was a few months or weeks before IMEC was announced that Prime Minister Modi went on what was the first visit of an Indian Prime Minister to Greece in decades. It was on his way back from the BRICS summit, and he stopped over in Athens. Now, that's exactly where India has a huge interest in acquiring ports, in particular the Adani Ports Group that is interested in buying a terminal in the Piraeus port of Greece. So you see the larger pieces coming together that tell you that there is an interest. Not necessarily, I think people have misunderstood this a little bit, not necessarily an end-to-end trade point that you're shipping something from Mumbai all the way to Germany through shipping, rail, across two seas and two continents, but in its various parts also. So there could be an element between India and the Gulf, within the Gulf, Gulf Europe. That larger logic is there, and it's also apparent in the non-trade element of the IMEC. There's a initiative to develop underwater sea cables to connect India to the Gulf countries, and it in terms of investments. So it tells you there's a larger supply chain interest, I think, between India and the European markets.
Tino, I just want to end with kind of just a final thought, ask you another unfair question here at the end. As you think about a new government coming to power, it'll most likely be Modi 3.0, but of course the results are yet to be seen, yet to be known. I want to ask you to help us identify, what are sort of one or two key priorities in regards to the neighborhood you would like to see this new government focus on in the summer of 2024 when the new term begins?
Oh, so much I can think of that could be done. It should be done. But, the big paradox, Milan, I just think is that India is doing in the neighborhood more than ever. It's doing faster. It's delivering faster than ever. And in many ways, it's better than ever. But the paradox is that it's still far too little, far too slow, and not good enough. That's the paradox, right? You're trying to do more, but you're dealing with a much more competitive region. So I'd say one thing, and I've been saying this repeatedly, is that while China has done a favor by waking up India from the slumber, I think this fixation on China is very detrimental. Because if you fixate too much on China, you're going to get into a logic of denying China, playing politics, and focus less resources and attention on what is most needed, which is the politics of delivery. Financial assistance, people-to-people ties, trade, investments, and really tie these countries to India in terms of a logic of economic independence. So less China, I'd say less. It's not that China poses a challenge or a threat sometimes, but less fixation on China. Second, a bit of a bold idea, since you're asking me for bold ideas, is some sort of a visa-free regime in the neighborhood. We did a study and found out that it's easier sometimes for Chinese nationals or American nationals to visit countries in this region than it is for nationals within this region to cross borders. Right. So that is these huge barriers to mobility that are really hindering convergence in the region. Now, this is difficult because of a variety of concerns, migration, labor protection. Some of the smaller countries are, in fact, the most opposed to this because they're concerned about massive migration of specialized or skilled labor from India into their economies. India has its own concerns in terms of the ethnic and ideological composition in its border states. But maybe something could be worked out where maybe which is what Europe is doing, for certain skilled professions, you could institute a visa-free regime or an open labor market, an integrated labor market, let's say in the BIMSTEC region, for example. The last thing, Milan, I've been asking for, and it really puzzles me, is that the neighboring countries around India have changed very fast. They're modernizing. We spoke about this. Their economies are growing. We did a study to look at where students from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka are going for higher education. And we found out they're going increasingly to China, in some ways more than even India, which is next door, has English language, is cheaper. They're going to new destinations like Japan, Australia, etc. And I think that reflects that in some ways the younger generation in South Asia is paradoxically, when it should be easier than ever today in an interdependent world with technology and mobility, less connected to India than its predecessors were. So I would invest massively in people-to-people ties, in younger elites and stakeholders in different sectors of Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh to come to India and get to know India. They simply do not know India. They often know the US, China, Japan more than they know next door India. And when I go and give talks and engage with people in Sri Lanka, I'm always surprised. I'll give you one last example. I asked one university in Sri Lanka, what languages do you teach in your international relations program? They told me Korean, Japanese, Spanish, Chinese, of course. And I asked, why not Hindi or Tamil, for example? And they said, no, those are old languages. Right. So that is the idea that this is the old neighborhood, the cultural bigger brother next door, but it's not a market of opportunities for growth for the younger generations in the neighboring countries. So I'd say a massive program in terms of visiting fellowships and support for younger leaders to come to this region, get to know the new India would be very beneficial.
My guest on the show this week is the scholar Constantino Xavier. He is a fellow in foreign policy and security studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, where he leads the Samband initiative on regional connectivity. Tino, we covered a lot of ground, from the Maldives to Sri Lanka to Nepal to China to the Middle East. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Milan, for having me.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.